My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. It began on a morning the world would never forget. Markets opened to silence. The stock tickers that once screamed with numbers were frozen in red. Traders in New York, London, and Tokyo stood motionless before screens filled with static. The dollar had fallen by 7% in an hour, then 10, then 15. Nobody understood how. The algorithms that govern the planet's wealth were convulsing, as if struck by a ghost. In the chaos, whispers spread like wildfire. A small West African nation was at the center of it all. A country too insignificant, too poor, too forgotten to shake the pillars of global finance. But somehow it had. Somewhere deep within the Sahel, a man watched the panic unfold. Ibrahim Traoré stood inside a dim control room, staring at a flickering map of the world as every currency line bled downward. His face was unreadable. Around him, aides whispered in disbelief. He said nothing. The world had mocked him once. A soldier turned leader, too idealistic, too stubborn to understand the realities of economics. They had said Africa was a market, not a power. They were wrong. What he had set in motion 12 months ago was finally surfacing. The West had spent centuries building walls of control, debt, dependency, and illusion, but all illusions end eventually. This was that moment. The world just hadn't realized it yet. A year earlier, there had been no chaos, only quiet humiliation. Burkina Faso's gold was leaving in secret convoys guarded by foreign troops. Its land was rich, its people hungry. The mines glowed like open wounds in the earth. Contracts written in languages no farmer could read sold generations into poverty. The government before him had signed everything away. When Traoré came to power, he found his nation shackled not by war but by spreadsheets. Every field, every river, every ounce of gold was owned by someone else. He met with his council in the old presidential compound, a building once funded by foreign aid, its marble chipped, its ceilings leaking. They sat under dim lamps, while power flickered from the unstable grid. His ministers spoke with fear in their voices. The IMF had issued another ultimatum. They wanted new mining rights, restructuring, and another loan with impossible terms. Failure to comply would mean sanctions, blacklisting, starvation. Traoré listened in silence. Outside, thousands waited in the streets, some chanting his name, others demanding food. The air smelled of dust and diesel. He thought of the children with empty bowls, of the soldiers guarding fields that yielded nothing for their families. The old leaders had traded their dignity for permission to survive, but survival was no longer enough. Something inside him hardened. He began studying the numbers himself, long nights with candles burning low, learning the code of the global economy. He realized it was not chaos but design, a machine built to keep certain nations kneeling. The system was invisible, enforced by fear and paper. Every loan was a leash, every partnership a trap. The gold Burkina Faso mined didn't enrich it. It fed foreign banks that dictated how much bread its people could eat. He started small. He refused a shipment contract that sent the country's gold abroad. Western advisors called him naive. Then he ordered all resource transactions to be reviewed, then nationalized, then audited. Within months, millions vanished from foreign accounts. The whispers began. Diplomats arrived with smiles too polite to hide their anger. Ambassadors warned him of economic consequences. When he didn't bend, they sent delegations, men in suits who spoke softly but carried invisible knives. "You need our markets," they said. "You need our aid." He said only, "We have our land." That sentence was enough to turn him into a problem. Behind closed doors, the IMF froze negotiations. The World Bank suspended funding. Neighboring governments were told to isolate him. Articles appeared in international newspapers calling him unstable, dangerous, a radical nationalist. But Traoré kept moving. He traveled across rural provinces, meeting farmers, miners, and soldiers. He asked them what freedom meant if a nation couldn't eat from its own soil. He saw mothers grinding millet by hand, while foreign trucks carried tons of gold past their villages. He saw classrooms without books, hospitals without medicine, fields dying under imported fertilizer debts. Every injustice burned itself into his mind. At night he would write in a notebook filled with questions. "How do you defeat an empire with no armies?" he scribbled. "How do you fight numbers on a screen?" The answer came slowly. You build new numbers. He began gathering allies, economists from the diaspora, coders from the underground, scientists, miners, and young soldiers loyal not to money but to purpose. They met in secret compounds, communication lines shielded by analog systems older than the internet. There, the blueprint for a new financial order was drawn. They called it the Sankara Initiative, after the fallen revolutionary who dreamed of a self-sufficient Africa. The plan was madness, to replace the dollar-based system with something backed by Africa's own resources: gold, cobalt, lithium, and land. Each unit of the new currency would represent something tangible, mined and held within African soil. No loans, no permission, no gatekeepers. It started quietly. Transactions between two small nations tested the model. Then a third joined. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic, but the data didn't lie. It worked. The digital backbone they built was untraceable by international systems. For the first time, Africa had a currency that couldn't be frozen, sanctioned, or devalued from abroad. Within 6 months, rumors reached European financial circles. Then panic. Anonymous memos circulated in Washington and London predicting economic contagion. The U.S. Treasury called an emergency meeting. The European Central Bank issued a private warning about unprecedented destabilization emerging from sub-Saharan Africa, but it was too late. The signal had spread. Nations weary of exploitation began to reach out. Small economies in Latin America, parts of Asia, and the Caribbean. The system welcomed them all. Each new member weakened the old order. Each transaction that bypassed the dollar chipped away at its throne. Traoré knew they would strike back. Spies returned to Ouagadougou disguised as consultants. Disinformation campaigns erupted online. Western NGOs began funding opposition movements under the banner of restoring democracy. A few of his closest advisors turned suddenly cold, their loyalty uncertain. The pressure mounted like a storm. Still he moved forward. Every dawn he rose before sunrise, praying briefly before scanning reports of markets trembling thousands of miles away. He felt no triumph, only the quiet knowledge that he had already crossed the point of no return. He had waged war on an empire of invisible chains, and there was no going back. The world was about to learn that revolutions no longer needed guns. All it took was one man willing to rewrite the code that enslaved his people. By the time the first sanctions hit, the damage had already been done. Burkina Faso was cut off from international banking systems overnight. Western media called it a necessary measure to maintain stability. But on the ground, it meant pharmacies without supplies, salaries unpaid, crops left to rot for lack of imported fuel. The country was suffocating, and the world watched like spectators at a slow execution. In Washington, they laughed. In Brussels, they strategized. In Paris, they called it poetic justice. But what none of them understood was that Traoré had already planned for isolation. He had predicted the cutoffs, the boycotts, the fake news campaigns. Every move they made, he had already prepared a counterweight. Inside the presidential bunker, a new team worked day and night, coders, engineers, economists, and soldiers guarding them with rifles slung across their shoulders. They called themselves the Network of Dust because, as one of them said, they think we are nothing. But dust can blind empires. They built their servers from scavenged hardware, powered by solar panels stitched together from old military equipment. The code they wrote was more than software. It was defiance written in logic. Through that system, the first phase of the AFRI standard came alive. It was invisible to international regulators, immune to IMF oversight, decentralized and self-sustaining. Transactions moved through encrypted relays buried in abandoned mines, hidden beneath the earth that had been exploited for centuries. Every byte of data felt like stolen sunlight reclaimed. But as his plan took shape, the pressure on Traoré grew unbearable. The West declared Burkina Faso a financial rogue state. Cargo ships carrying medicine and fuel were turned away at ports. Neighboring leaders were bribed or threatened into closing their borders. Foreign news outlets ran footage of starving children, blaming him for their suffering. They didn't show that aid convoys were being intercepted before they reached the people. At night, in the silence of his quarters, Traoré felt the weight of every face that looked to him for hope. He read letters from mothers asking for bread, soldiers begging for ammunition, teachers who hadn't been paid in months. The isolation was total. He could trust almost no one. Then came the first betrayal. One of his own ministers, a man he had known since the academy, vanished after a meeting with European diplomats. The next day, encrypted data vanished from their servers. Trade secrets, transaction chains, partner lists. Weeks of work destroyed. Traoré didn't order his arrest. He simply stared at the empty chair during the next meeting and said quietly, "He's already punished. He will never understand what he abandoned." But hope persisted in small miracles. Farmers began trading directly through the AFRI system. A village once ignored by the government built its own solar farm using collective funds. Children started receiving stipends directly in digital credit, bypassing corrupt intermediaries. The revolution was no longer theoretical. It was alive in the dust, spreading beyond borders, whispering through markets and alleys. As months passed, Western leaders grew desperate. They summoned emergency meetings behind closed doors. Trump returned to the political stage, calling Traoré a dangerous radical. Biden warned that unregulated economic experiments threaten global peace. Putin dismissed him as a Western pawn gone rogue. Xi remained silent but tightened surveillance on African networks. The irony was perfect. 4 rival powers united by fear of one African man's idea. And yet, inside Burkina Faso, things were crumbling. Power outages became routine. Crops failed under erratic rains. The sanctions had starved trade routes, and the black market thrived in their place. Food prices tripled. Crime crept through the capital's edges. For the first time, even his loyal supporters began to question him. "We believe in you," they whispered. "But how long must we starve before freedom feeds us?" Traoré visited the streets disguised under a cloak, listening to his people in secret. He heard mothers crying at bakeries with no bread left. He saw old men bartering radios for rice. He didn't speak. He only watched, his eyes filled with quiet fire. When he returned to the palace, he gathered his advisors and said, "If they have made us poor by design, then we will make poverty impossible by truth." He ordered the second phase, the public launch of the AFRI standard. It would no longer be a secret project. It would be the declaration of a new order. The day the network went live, half the world's financial servers stuttered. Untraceable transfers rippled across continents as small nations connected to the system. Independent traders from South America and Asia joined in. Every transaction that bypassed the dollar weakened the web that held the old order together. Western leaders responded like predators sensing a threat to their food supply. Cyber attacks hit the system. Communications were jammed. Anonymous military drones appeared over remote installations. One night, a missile struck the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Officially, it was an accident. But everyone knew it was a warning. In the midst of chaos, a quiet alliance formed, whispers between African capitals. Presidents who had once avoided Traoré now sent emissaries to his doorstep, offering resources, protection, data. Mali joined first, then Guinea, then the Congo. The continent that had been divided by colonial borders for a century was awakening. The idea was no longer his alone, but success brought new shadows. Foreign agents infiltrated communication lines, sowing distrust. Rumors spread that Traoré had hidden millions in offshore accounts. Protests erupted small but loud. "He has betrayed us," they shouted outside the capital gates. His advisors urged him to make a speech, to defend himself. He refused. "Words are weak when truth is working," he said. Yet beneath the resolve, exhaustion was consuming him. Sleep became rare. He began seeing faces from his past. Soldiers lost in battle, mentors long dead, ghosts of promises broken. He carried a small locket with the photo of a child he'd met during the revolution. A girl who once asked him, "Can freedom make bread?" He had no answer then. He still had none now. By the ninth month, the Western markets began trembling again. Reports leaked that major investment banks were losing liquidity. Analysts warned of a silent shift of reserves toward unknown currencies. Politicians dismissed it publicly but panicked privately. They had underestimated the chain reaction, the way one small nation's defiance could infect an entire global system. As the 12th month approached, the tension reached its peak. The world's eyes turned toward Africa. Some hoped to see collapse, others prayed for survival. In a hidden conference room beneath the capital, Traoré gathered his final council. Maps covered the walls, filled with red lines representing severed ties to the Western network. He looked at the numbers glowing on the screen before him. The AFRI standard had officially matched the global trade value of the euro. The unthinkable had happened, and yet he said nothing. He only turned to his people and whispered, "We are not done. The real war begins when they realize we've already won." The 12th month began like a whisper before a storm. Across the Western world, economists spoke in nervous tones, their graphs bleeding red. The U.S. Treasury denied the rumors, yet banks were quietly collapsing. London's financial district fell into a panic when overnight lending rates spiked beyond comprehension. The IMF called for emergency stabilization. Nobody could explain why. But deep beneath the Sahel sun, the reason was simple. A new heartbeat had replaced the old. The AFRI standard, once dismissed as a naive experiment, was now pulsing through nations like a second bloodstream. Every trade that bypassed the dollar, every shipment cleared through the new system, cut another invisible wire holding the old empire together. Inside Burkina Faso, however, silence ruled the palace. The halls were dark, powered by generators that coughed in the night. Outside the walls, soldiers patrolled streets lined with flickering lamps. The people were hungry, but they endured. They had learned to wait, to trust that something far greater than survival was taking shape. Then came the final blow. In early November, a series of cyber attacks struck the AFRI network. Servers crashed in Mali, Guinea, and Niger. Communications went dark for days. The Western Alliance denied involvement, but intercepted transmissions told a different story. Multinational coordination, originating from the same digital arteries that once controlled global currency. Inside the war room, Traoré stood before a circle of screens showing the chaos. Advisors shouted data across the room, fingers flying across keyboards, trying to isolate the breaches. His security chief turned to him. "If we lose the core node, the entire network collapses." Traoré's response was quiet. "Then we rebuild from the ashes." For 48 hours, the system flickered between life and death. Panic gripped allied nations. Some leaders called for retreat, to negotiate, to surrender, to restore peace. But Traoré refused to step back. "Peace built on submission," he said, "is war disguised as mercy." As the cyber attacks intensified, so did the physical ones. Drone footage captured silhouettes near the borders, private military contractors, hired shadows with no flags. Explosions echoed through the night skies. The message was clear: kneel or burn. And yet, in the midst of ruin, hope took root. African youth began rallying in the streets, carrying flags made from torn cloth and painted words, "Afri rise." Farmers refused to sell crops to foreign buyers. Miners blocked roads leading to Western-owned sites. Across the continent, silence turned into a roar. On the 12th night of that brutal month, an emergency summit was held underground, literal underground, inside a former mining tunnel converted into a secure command chamber. Leaders from 11 nations gathered around a single table. The air smelled of earth and iron. The light came from battery-powered lanterns. Traoré arrived last, his uniform dusty, eyes hollow, but burning with intent. Without ceremony, he placed a folder on the table, documents, encrypted drives, and a declaration marked by his own signature. "This," he said, "is the final phase." Inside that folder was the blueprint for the Continental Reserve Accord, a radical economic shift that would transfer every participating nation's gold and mineral reserves into a unified digital reserve, owned collectively, without foreign intermediaries. In one stroke, it would sever all dependence on Western banking systems. The room fell silent. The leaders exchanged fearful glances. One of them whispered, "They will destroy us." Traoré looked up slowly. They already have. Now we decide whether we remain ruins or rebuild as something unbreakable. No one spoke for several minutes. Then one by one, hands reached for pens. 11 signatures followed. History turned. News of the accord spread within hours. Western intelligence agencies confirmed it by dawn. Chaos erupted across global markets. The dollar fell 10% in a day. The euro followed. The yuan slipped in silence. What had been an invisible rebellion was now an open revolt. The retaliation came instantly. Power grids failed across the continent. Communications satellites were jammed. A coordinated cyber blockade isolated Africa entirely. Planes were grounded. Banks froze all African assets. Western leaders appeared on television, promising to restore order. The world believed it was over, but they didn't understand what Traoré had prepared for. Months earlier, during the quiet before the storm, he had authorized the construction of mirror nodes, hidden servers buried in deep bunkers across the desert, mountains, and rainforests. Independent power, independent code. When the main network fell, the mirrors awakened. The Afri Standard came back online like a ghost returning from the dead. For 3 days, the world trembled. Trade systems scrambled to adjust. Commodity markets halted entirely. Journalists spoke of the digital plague. But those closest to the truth knew this wasn't a plague. It was liberation coded into silicon. As Western currencies collapsed, so did the illusion of invincibility. In New York, traders stared at empty screens. In Paris, ministers shouted through dead phone lines. In London, Parliament declared a financial state of emergency. In Tokyo, news anchors trembled as they read the words. Global reserve collapse. Source: Burkina Faso. The very nations that once lectured Africa on governance were now in freefall. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the sun rose over a city battered but alive. Traoré stood on a balcony overlooking the capital. Below him, thousands had gathered, not in protest, but in silence. No music, no slogans, just eyes lifted to the sky. They didn't know the details, only that something irreversible had happened. He spoke softly to the soldiers beside him. We were told we could not exist without them. Today they cannot exist without us. His words spread through the ranks, then through the streets, then across the borders. What began as whispers became chants, songs, and marches. Across Africa, cities erupted in unity. Flags waved where there had once been despair. Markets reopened, not with dollars, but with Afri credits, real value for real work. But in the final hours of that day, as the sun sank into the horizon, Traoré received a message. An intercepted transmission, encrypted, bearing Western signatures. The contents were brief and cold. You have one last chance to surrender. The system ends tonight. He didn't answer. At midnight, a wave of digital strikes hit every major African server simultaneously. For a moment, everything went black. The Afri network blinked out of existence. Panic spread. Then, one single server in the desert blinked alive. Its signal jumped from one node to another, bouncing through the hidden mirrors like lightning across a storm. Within seconds, the entire system resurrected itself. It was then the world understood. The revolution was no longer dependent on one man or one nation. It was alive in millions. In that instant, every Western financial hub fell silent. The stock exchanges froze. Screens displayed a single line of text, written in an unfamiliar code, a message translated hours later by experts: the chains are broken. For centuries, wealth had flowed one way. Now, for the first time, it reversed. And as dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood in the quiet hum of machines still running against all odds. His reflection glimmered faintly in the polished metal of the console before him. He looked neither triumphant nor broken, only resolved. He had done what no one thought possible. Rewritten the story of power itself. The world that woke up after that final night was not the same one that had gone to sleep. The first sunrise after the collapse of the Western financial system came quietly, almost humbly, as if the planet itself was exhaling after centuries of suffocation. Across the major capitals, Washington, London, Paris, Tokyo, the screens that once pulsed with stock prices and currency values were now blank. flickering relics of a system that had consumed itself. Economists filled newsrooms with words like unprecedented, irreversible, epochal. For the first time in modern history, the world was not ruled by a currency backed by power, but by trust, and that trust had shifted southward. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets swelled with people, not in chaos this time, but in pride. The markets were alive again, humming with traders using digital AFRI credits on handheld devices powered by solar grids. The sound of commerce had returned, not as the echo of dependency, but as the heartbeat of freedom. Children ran barefoot through the dust, waving tiny flags painted with the AFRI logo, a circle split by sun and earth. Inside the palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the council that had endured every sleepless night of the revolution. The men and women seated around him were no longer just ministers or generals. They were symbols, proof that unity born of struggle could defy empires. One of the advisors, an elderly economist who had once studied in France, spoke first. "We have won," he said, voice trembling. "But now, we must learn to live without the enemy we've known all our lives." Traoré nodded. "Freedom is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning of responsibility." He turned toward the massive window overlooking the city, where banners fluttered from rooftops and drums echoed from the distance. "They called us reckless," he continued. "They said we were naive to challenge centuries of domination. But here we stand, and the world is watching. What we build next will decide whether this was revolution or rebirth." Beyond the palace walls, new networks began to form. South America reached out first, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, seeking to join the new economic bloc. Southeast Asia followed. Within weeks, over 40 nations had signed interest declarations to adopt the AFRI standard or establish direct trade routes through it. The Western world could no longer ignore it. Emergency summits were called across Europe and the United States. Behind closed doors, leaders whispered of containment strategies, but their words felt hollow. The old power had evaporated, not through war, but through exposure. At the United Nations, the hall fell silent when Traoré appeared on the global broadcast. His uniform was plain. No medals, no pomp. Just the calm authority of a man who had faced the full weight of the world and did not bend. "Humanity," he began, his voice echoing through every translation feed, "has spent centuries believing that strength means control. That value means domination. But when one part of the world is enslaved by another, all are enslaved, even those who hold the chains." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "We were told to wait for progress, to accept poverty in exchange for peace. We were told that independence was a word, not a right. Yet here we are, not because we waited, but because we remembered who we are. Across continents, millions watched with tears in their eyes, Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, indigenous people from forgotten corners of the earth, all seeing a reflection of their own fight in his words." Traoré raised a small tablet in his hand, showing the AFRI system interface glowing faintly. "This is not just code," he said. "It is proof that we can create our own destiny without permission." Applause thundered through the UN chamber. Some delegates rose to their feet. Others sat still, watching history rewrite itself before their eyes. Yet even as the world celebrated, Traoré remained cautious. He knew that victory built on resentment could rot from within. He ordered immediate reforms, transparency protocols, equal trade policies, renewable energy initiatives, and educational programs designed to train the next generation of digital economists and engineers. "This revolution must never depend on one man," he told his council that night. "If I fall tomorrow, the system must stand without me." And so it did. Months later, Western nations began to stabilize, but the world order had been permanently reshaped. The US launched a new digital dollar, this time pegged partially to renewable energy reserves, an idea borrowed quietly from the AFRI framework. Europe followed with its green euro. For once, Africa was no longer copying. It was being copied. Global trade began to balance. Natural resources that had once been exported at slave prices were now traded at fair market value. New African-led companies rose, investing in technology, medicine, and clean energy. The continent that had been pitied for centuries became the teacher. But Ibrahim Traoré did not seek glory. He rarely appeared in public after that year. Some said he was exhausted, others that he wanted to ensure no cult of personality replaced the system he built. His final public address came on the one-year anniversary of the Free Standard. Standing before a crowd of millions, he spoke simply. They said Africa was the past. I say Africa's the future, but only if we never forget what it cost to rise. As the crowd erupted in cheers, drums thundered through the capital, echoing across the plains like the rhythm of a new dawn. The camera pulled back, over the golden rooftops, over the markets, over the horizon where the first solar arrays shimmered in the desert sun. The world, once ruled by empires, now spun under a shared sky of equals. The currencies had changed, but more importantly, so had belief. In the quiet of his chamber that night, Traoré sat alone, gazing at the stars above Ouagadougou, the same stars that had watched over generations of struggle. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself words only the wind could hear. Let them build what they could not destroy. And in that moment, the future began, not with fire or war, but with the steady heartbeat of a continent reborn. Years had passed since the collapse, not in chaos, but in clarity. The echoes of Ibrahim Traoré's defiance had outlived the panic, the threats, and the disbelief. What began as one man's rebellion against a predatory system had become a living framework, one that stretched from the dunes of the Sahara to the ports of South America, from the jungles of Congo to the financial towers of Dubai. The world was no longer divided into developed and developing. Those words had lost meaning. What mattered now was contribution, innovation, and integrity. And in that new era, Africa had become the pulse of progress. The Free Standard had matured. No longer just a digital currency, it evolved into an entire ecosystem, a decentralized network that balanced production, labor, and sustainability. It was a system built not on the illusion of wealth, but on the reality of work. It rewarded nations not for speculation, but for creation. By year 5, Western corporations began to migrate their infrastructures to the AFRI chain, drawn by its transparency and the absence of manipulation. What had once been laughed off as an African experiment had become the backbone of the global economy. Yet, in all of it, Ibrahim Traoré had faded from the spotlight. He refused statues, refused to rename streets after himself, refused to be seen as a savior. To him, hero worship was the seed of decay, the very thing that had doomed so many revolutions before his. He had moved to a quiet village in northern Burkina Faso, near where he was born. The people called him simply the captain, though his uniform had long been traded for plain robes. He spent his mornings tending to the earth, and his evenings mentoring children beneath the wide, red sky. But the world had not forgotten. Every year, on the anniversary of the economic liberation, known across the continent as the day Africa rose, millions gathered in squares and cities, lighting candles and projecting holograms of his speeches onto buildings. His words, those first few declarations of defiance, had become scripture in classrooms and military academies alike. The power of money is not in gold, he had said, but in the belief that men have in themselves. And now, that belief had spread farther than even he imagined. Across the globe, old monuments of colonial rulers were quietly dismantled, replaced with murals of African scientists, engineers, and farmers. Trade routes once controlled by foreign powers were now regulated by joint African-led councils. A new continental railway linked Dakar to Nairobi, funded entirely through AFRI credits, the same system once mocked as a fantasy. The nations that had once demanded sanctions were now signing partnership treaties. America rebuilt its ties under humility, not dominance. China and Russia both sought inclusion in the Pan-African Infrastructure Pact, a collaborative fund that distributed resources equitably across continents. The irony of it all is the same. Institutions that had tried to destroy Traoré's vision were now dependent on it to survive. But Traoré himself, now older, thinner, his beard streaked with grey, no longer sought validation. His revolution was not measured in applause or treaties. It was measured in the quiet dignity of his people. He often walked through the village unnoticed, passing farmers who greeted him with respect but without ceremony. To them, he was not a symbol. He was one of them. One evening, as the sun bled gold into the horizon, he was approached by a young girl holding a tablet. On its screen glowed the AFRI system. Now so advanced it could be accessed anywhere, even without signal towers. "Captain," she said shyly, "my teacher says this exists because of you." He smiled softly. "No," he said, "it exists because of you. I only reminded the world to stop waiting." The girl looked at him with the same hope that once drove men to risk their lives in revolution. And for the first time in many years, he felt something stir. Not pride, but peace. That night, he sat beneath the same stars he'd gazed at years ago, when everything seemed impossible. He could hear the distant hum of solar engines, the faint laughter of children, and the rhythm of drums carried on the wind. Africa was alive. He wrote one final letter before sleep claimed him, not a political document, not a farewell speech, but a reflection. We were born beneath the shadow of empires. We were told to serve, to obey, to wait. But the day came when the earth itself could no longer bear silence. We stood. We built, we bled, and when they came to crush us, we offered not hatred but proof. Proof that freedom, when built with honesty, cannot be destroyed, only delayed. The chains were not broken by gold or by guns, but by the courage to believe in our own worth. Let no generation forget, the world is not changed by those who ask for permission. The next morning, the captain did not rise. The village awoke to a stillness too heavy to name. Yet as the news spread, there were no tears, only a quiet unity. In Ouagadougou, church bells and mosque calls echoed together. Across Africa, the AFRI network paused for 1 minute of silence, the system he had built, paying tribute to the man who had built it. And when the pause ended, the screens of every device on the continent lit up with a single line. He destroyed their system, so that we could build ours. The camera would fade out then, slowly, over the plains of Burkina Faso, as dawn broke once again. Fields glistened under a new sun. Children chased after the rising light, their laughter merging with the hum of wind turbines and the distant pulse of drums. The story had ended, but the era had only just begun.